February 1880. A mob of masked men marched silently through the darkened roads of Biddulph Township, Ontario, Canada. Their destination? The homestead of the Black Donnellys, a family whose name had become synonymous with violence, feuds, and fear. Before sunrise, 5 people would be dead, an entire family line nearly wiped out, and a community forever stained by the act now remembered as the Massacre of the Black Donnellys, one of Canada's most infamous and unsolved mass murders. This is the story of how a small Irish immigrant family became the focus of a decades-long feud that spiraled into brutality, and how their killers walked away free. To understand the massacre, we need to go back almost 40 years before that night, to the arrival of James and Johanna Donnelly, Irish immigrants fleeing poverty and turmoil in Tipperary. They settled in Biddulph Township, part of what was then the rural frontier of southwestern Ontario. This region was home to a large number of Irish Catholics, but they were not a unified community. Old world divisions had followed them across the Atlantic, including rivalries tied to land, religion, and secret societies. James Donnelly attempted to build a new life through hard work and perseverance, but almost immediately he found himself in conflict, first over land. The Donnellys occupied a piece of land known as the Roman Line, a concession road with a reputation for trouble. When 2 settlers claimed overlapping rights to the same lot, including James Donnelly, tensions escalated. And then came the fight that changed everything. At a logging bee in 1857, a violent brawl broke out between James Donnelly and Patrick Farrell, one of his rivals. Witnesses disagreed about what started it, but Farrell was killed, and James Donnelly was charged with murder. Though initially sentenced to hang, his punishment was reduced to 7 years in Kingston Penitentiary, largely because of community petitions requesting mercy. But the stain of that crime followed the family forever, fueling the idea that the Donnellys were violent, dangerous, and uncontrollable. Biddulph Township, located in what is now Middlesex County, Ontario, was a rural farming community during the mid to late 19th century. The township was first surveyed in the early 1800s and settled largely by Irish immigrants fleeing famine, poverty, and political instability. Many settlers came from counties like Tipperary, Kilkenny, and Waterford, bringing with them old world traditions, rivalries, and divisions. The landscape was dense forest with patches of swamp, slowly cleared for farming, but life was hard, isolated, and apparently often violent. A crucial aspect of Biddulph's identity was the intense division between different groups of Irish settlers. These rivalries were carried straight from Ireland to Canada. Largely Catholic versus Protestant tensions, old faction disputes from Ireland, and secret societies like the White Boys, Ribbonmen, and Orangemen. These groups often clashed over land, livestock, and local influence. Fights with barn burnings and intimidation were not rare, and they were a woven fact of everyday life. One of the most notorious roads in the township was the Roman Line, where the Donnellys lived. The area earned a reputation for feuds, unsolved crimes, property disputes, and vigilante justice. It was the roughest part of an already rough settlement. Many families living there were poor, armed, and fiercely protective of their land. Further, in the 19th century, Biddulph had very limited policing. Constables were often locals who had personal ties or grudges instead of formal justice. Many residents relied on retaliation, community pressure, and vigilante groups. The environment allowed tensions to escalate without effective intervention. By the 1870s, growing frustration with crime, real or perceived, led to the creation of the Biddulph Peace Society, commonly known as the Vigilance community. Its purpose was supposedly to restore order, but in practice it became a weapon for settling scores and, in some cases, targeting the Donnellys specifically. By the time of the massacre in 1880, Biddulph Township was split into factions. Neighbors lived in fear of each other, courts struggled to enforce law, rumors and grudges carried as much weight as actual evidence, and generations of animosity were ready to explode. The Donnellys were not the only family involved in fights, but they became the lightning rod for nearly every conflict. So what about the Donnellys? Well, the Donnellys' background originated in Tipperary, Ireland. The Donnelly family came from the county of Tipperary, a region in Ireland known throughout the 18th and 19th centuries for severe poverty, harsh land tenancy systems, recurring political unrest, and violent agrarian conflicts between landlords and tenant farmers. James Donnelly grew up in this world, a place where land meant survival and disputes over it frequently turned violent. In Ireland, land generally wasn't owned outright. It was often leased from landlords who held enormous power. Rent was high, tenant rights were almost non-existent, and eviction was common and often brutal. Like many Irish Catholic families, the Donnellys lived a farming life. They worked the land but had little security or control over it. The instability, paired with a growing population and shrinking farmland, left younger families like the Donnellys with bleak prospects. James Donnelly came of age during a period marked by the Tithe Wars, conflicts over mandatory payments to the Protestant Church of Ireland. In addition, there was a lot of faction fighting and secret societies like the White Boys and the Ribbonmen, which used sabotage and intimidation to resist evictions. Even if the Donnelly family wasn't directly part of any of these groups, whether in Ireland or Canada, the atmosphere of fear, retaliation, and community feuds shaped their worldview, and later would contribute to how they were perceived within their community. James would marry Johanna, originally Johanna Maggie, in 1840. Johanna came from a Catholic Irish farming background similar to James. She also grew up in poverty with strict social structures and church-oriented community life. Together, James and Johanna faced the same obstacles that pushed thousands of Irish families towards emigration. The Donnelly family left Ireland later that year, before the height of the Great Famine, but during a period of rising hardship. Their reasons mirrored those of countless other families. Lack of secure land or future opportunity, growing tensions with landlords, economic decline, and a desire to escape the cycle of violence and poverty. Further, Canada was rumored to be cheap and have new beginnings, especially for immigrants. For people like Donnellys, leaving Ireland wasn't just a choice, it was a bid for survival and an elevated lifestyle. When James and Johanna boarded their ship destined for North America, they were looking for a life that would hopefully include stable farmland, safer living conditions, and a clean slate. Ironically, many of the same conditions they fled, land disputes, faction tensions, and social divisions, re-emerged in Biddulph Township, ultimately shaping the tragic course of their Canadian story. When James returned from prison, the Donnelly family was already infamous. Rumors spread quickly through rural communities, and the Donnellys became subject of countless accusations. They included arson, horse theft, assault, sabotage, threatening neighbors, and involvement in local feuds. Some of these claims were exaggerated, some were outright fabricated, but a few of them were true. The Donnelly sons, specifically Tom, Will, and Patrick, were known to be tough, hot-tempered, and unwilling to back down from a fight. But many conflicts actually stemmed from situations where the Donnellys felt they were just defending themselves against harassment, prejudice, or vigilante justice. The community was divided. Some respected the Donnellys as hard-working settlers who stood their ground. Others saw them as a criminal family who constantly skirted the law. By 1870, Biddulph Township was a powder keg. Rival factions, often divided along the lines of old Irish secret societies like the White Boys and Orangemen, frequently clashed. Barn burnings, beatings, and threats were part of everyday life, and in the middle of this cultural battlefield stood the Donnelly family. As the 1870s progressed, violence escalated sharply. The Donnelly sons became embroiled in disputes over roads, horses, and tavern politics. They also had a history with the local constable, who often arrested them on questionable evidence. To restore quote-unquote order, locals formed a vigilante group known as the Biddulph Peace Society, or more commonly known as the Vigilance Community. Their stated purpose was to combat crime, but in practice, their main target was the Donnelly family. Meetings were held in secret, members often wore disguises, and soon whispers began spreading that the Vigilance community had a deadly mission. Meanwhile, criminal charges were mounting on both sides. Tom Donnelly and his brother-in-law were accused of involvement in arson. Many believe these charges were fabricated, or at least exaggerated, to justify the broader plan to eliminate the Donnellys altogether. A trial was scheduled for early February 1880. Tension in the township reached a breaking point prior to this, and the community felt as though either the Donnellys or the Vigilance community would need to be destroyed. And the Vigilance community would be the first to strike. February 4th, 1880, would be the night. The night that the Donnellys faced their massacre. Around midnight, a group of 20 to 40 masked men gathered on the Roman line. Armed with clubs and farm tools, they moved towards the Donnelly homestead. Their first target, the home of James and Johanna Donnelly, where several family members were staying. Inside the house were James and Johanna Donnelly, Tom Donnelly, Bridget, their young housemaid, and Johnny O'Connor, a visiting teenage boy who was sleeping upstairs. The mob surrounded the home and eventually forced their entry. What followed was chaos. Tom Donnelly was beaten first. James and Joanna were attacked next. Bridget the maid was killed as well, and the attackers used clubs, pitchforks, and other blunt instruments. The brutality was extreme. The victims suffered massive head injuries. Upstairs, Johnny O'Connor hid beneath the bed. He watched through the slats as the gang moved throughout the house with lanterns. He stayed frozen as the mob set the house on fire before leaving. Johnny managed to escape out a window, running barefoot through the snow to a neighbor's house to sound the alarm. But by the time he arrived, it was already too late. The Donnelly homestead was engulfed in flames, and the mob wasn't finished yet. They moved next to the house of William Donnelly, another son. But through a combination of luck and quick thinking, William fled into the night before the vigilantes could reach him. If they had caught him, their entire immediate family might have been eradicated in that single night. News of the massacre spread quickly. In the morning, charred remains of the victims were retrieved from the ashes. The community was horrified, at least publicly. Privately, many felt the Donnelly problem had finally been solved. But the law was forced to take action. Witnesses eventually came forward, some claiming they recognized voices or saw faces that night. A handful of Vigilance community members were arrested, including one named James Carroll, a local constable suspected of leading the attack. The trial that followed became one of the most notorious in early Canadian legal history. Despite strong testimony, especially from young Johnny O'Connor, whose eyewitness accounts were critical, public sentiment heavily favored the accused. 2 trials would be held. The prosecution argued that the Vigilance community had conspired to kill the Donnellys and carried out the massacre as a coordinated attack. Witnesses testified about disguises, meetings, and threats made beforehand. But the defense took advantage of the community's prejudice. They painted the Donnellys as violent criminals whose deaths were inevitable results of their own behavior. Some jurors openly admitted they feared retaliation if they convicted the accused. After weeks of testimony, both trials ended the same way. No convictions. No one was ever punished for the massacre. Not a single member of the mob was held accountable. The message to the public was clear. In Biddulph Township, the law could be overruled by fear, loyalty, and silence. Today, the massacre of the Black Donnellys remains one of the most chilling examples of vigilante violence in Canadian history. Debate still rages to some extent. Were the Donnellys truly criminals? Or were they victims of racist, prejudiced local politics in a rural area? Did they provoke the hatred, or were they scapegoated by a community looking for someone to blame? The truth lies somewhere in between. What is certain is this: the massacre was not the result of one night of violence. It was the culmination of decades of conflict, resentment, and fear. A family tried to build a life, a community grew divided, and on one winter night in 1880, justice, morality, and law collapsed into chaos. The Donnellys' names survive today through books, plays, museums, and ghost stories, but the identities of their killers, though likely known by many at the time, have faded into silence. The massacre, at its core, remains unsolved, in that we don't have any names. The wounds, unhealed, and the legend of the Black Donnellys, forever rooted in Canadian history.